You wake up choking on dust. The year is 883 BC. You're chained to a line of prisoners outside the burning city of Suru. The screams haven't stopped for 3 days. Above you towers the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II on his war chariot. He's smiling. Not the smile of victory, the smile of a man who has turned cruelty into art. Then you see it, a forest of human skins flapping in the wind like flags. Some still have faces. One of them used to be the rebel leader you followed. This isn't a battle. This is the opening act of something far worse. What I'm about to show you is the part of ancient history they deliberately left out of textbooks. The systematic terror factory that was the Assyrian Empire at its peak. This isn't exaggeration. Every horror you're about to hear was proudly recorded by the Assyrians themselves on palace walls. In royal annals, on massive stone obelisks, they forced conquered people to read. They didn't hide their atrocities, they advertised them. If you stay until the end, you'll understand why even seasoned Assyrian soldiers sometimes broke down weeping at what their own kings demanded. Hollywood gave you Rome's Colosseum. What they never showed you was the original empire of calculated nightmare that made Rome look restrained. The Assyrians didn't just conquer, they weaponized psychology centuries before anyone else even understood the concept. Modern historians had to invent a term for what they did: calculated frightfulness. The goal wasn't just to win wars, it was to make resistance psychologically impossible, and they documented everything with bureaucratic precision that would make the Romans jealous. Before we descend into the actual tortures, I need you to do something right now. Look at the like button. If you believe the true history of human darkness deserves to be remembered, even when it makes you physically sick, smash that like button and comment the word Assyria so I know you're still with me. Because this story isn't just about the past, it's about what humans are capable of when terror becomes state policy. Now, let's walk through the gates of hell they built. To understand Assyrian torture, you have to understand their innovation. They were the first empire to make cruelty a science. This wasn't random sadism. This was engineered terror with specific techniques designed to maximize pain, humiliation, and most importantly, the stories that survivors would carry back home. When an Assyrian army approached a city, the psychological warfare began long before the first arrow flew. They didn't send diplomats. They sent heralds carrying detailed descriptions of what had happened to the last city that resisted. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser III shows prisoners being led past massive carvings depicting exactly what awaited them. Men being flayed alive, tongues ripped out, eyes gouged while they were still conscious. But the real genius was in the progression. The Assyrians had a system. First came the offer: surrender immediately and pay tribute, or face the treatment reserved for rebels. Most cities surrendered. Those that didn't became object lessons. When the walls fell, the processing began. This was industrialized horror. Assyrian scribes recorded everything: how many killed, how many enslaved, how many subjected to specific punishments. The royal annals read like production reports. King Ashurnasirpal II, the same man who smiled at the forest of skins, wrote this about one campaign, and I'm quoting directly from his own palace inscriptions. I built a pillar at the city gate, and I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I walled up inside the pillar, some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes. Many captives from among them I burned with fire, and many I took as living captives. From some I cut off their hands and their fingers, and from others I cut off their noses, their ears, and their fingers. I put out the eyes of many soldiers. He wrote this as a flex. This was his LinkedIn profile. But here's what makes this different from every other ancient empire. The Assyrians understood virality. They wanted these stories to spread. They forced survivors to carry the message. After destroying a city, they'd select specific prisoners for display punishment and then release them, maimed and broken, to limp back to neighboring kingdoms with first-hand accounts. The flaying was their signature. They perfected the technique. Assyrian reliefs show the process in detail. The victim tied, spread-eagled, the skin carefully cut along the limbs, peeled back while the person was still alive. The palace walls of Nineveh have scenes of scribes taking notes while this happens, because accuracy mattered. One relief shows a flayed man still conscious, watching his own skin being nailed to the city wall. But flaying was just the beginning. They had specialties. The tongue ripping was reserved for liars and blasphemers. Assyrian soldiers carried special bronze pincers designed specifically for this. They'd force the victim's mouth open, grab the tongue and pull it out by the root. Then they'd parade the victim through the streets so everyone could see what happened when you spoke against the king. Eye gouging was another favorite. They had a specific tool for this too, a curved bronze implement that hooked behind the eyeball and popped it out. The white obelisk shows rows of prisoners with empty sockets, blood streaming down their faces, being marched past the king who sits calmly eating dates. They burned people alive in ways designed to prolong suffering. One technique involved building a slow fire under a bronze platform. The victim was chained on top and cooked gradually while the king held court. The annals describe victims begging for death that wouldn't come for hours. Impalement was elevated to performance art. They didn't just drive a stake through the body. They had two methods. The Persian method which they adopted involved a sharpened stake driven through the rectum until it emerged from the shoulder. The victim was then planted upright. Death took days. The other method was through the chest, carefully positioned to miss vital organs so the person remained conscious, sometimes for up to 3 days. But the psychological masterpiece was what they did with the bodies afterward. After mass executions, they built pyramids of severed heads. Not metaphorically, actual pyramids. The Annals of Tiglath-Pileser III describe one pile containing 14,000 heads. Another king boasts of making mountains of skulls outside city gates that were visible for miles. They made jewelry from body parts. Assyrian kings wore necklaces of severed ears and noses taken from enemy dead. One relief shows a king pouring wine while his servants count piles of severed hands like accountants doing inventory. They forced family members to watch. The annals describe bringing wives and children to witness the slow death of husbands and fathers. One inscription reads, "Their men young and old I cut down like grass. I had their women and children watch as I flayed their king alive." Even their own soldiers weren't immune to the horror. Assyrian letters preserved on clay tablets show veterans writing home about nightmares. One soldier wrote, "I cannot sleep for the screams I have heard." Another describes breaking down in tears during a campaign because the king demanded they skin prisoners while they were still breathing. The kings themselves participated. This wasn't delegated to underlings. Ashurnasirpal II personally flayed rebel leaders. Sennacherib boasts of cutting off the hands of prisoners with his own sword. These weren't men who ordered torture from afar. They were hands-on artists of suffering. The palaces were designed around this. The throne room of Ashurnasirpal II in Nimrud had walls covered floor to ceiling with reliefs of torture. When foreign ambassadors visited, they had to walk through corridors showing exactly what happened to those who defied Assyria. One ambassador from Babylon reportedly fainted at the sight. They even had torture tourism. Conquered kings were forced to visit Nineveh and tour the palace walls, reading the inscriptions that described their own future if they rebelled. The psychological pressure was constant. But the most sophisticated horror was what they did with the living. They had a category of prisoner called the exhibited. These weren't killed immediately. They were kept alive in permanent public torment. Some were chained to city walls with iron collars that allowed minimal movement. Others were placed in cages suspended from towers. The annals describe people kept like this for years, slowly starving while birds pecked at their wounds. One technique involved burying people up to their necks in the desert and leaving them for the sun and ants. Another was the boat. 2 small boats joined together with the victim's head and hands protruding through holes, then left to rot in the sun while fed just enough to stay alive. They understood psychological torture too. One method involved telling prisoners they were free to go, leading them to the city gates, then flaying them just outside so their screams carried back into the city they'd hoped to return to. The children weren't spared. The annals describe dashing infants against rocks, cutting open pregnant women, forcing mothers to watch their children being burned alive. One inscription reads, "I burned their adolescent boys and girls." This wasn't wartime excess, this was policy. The kings competed with each other. Each new ruler had to outdo his predecessors in documented cruelty to prove his strength. The inscriptions get progressively worse as kings try to top each other. Even religion was weaponized. The Assyrian god Ashur demanded blood. The priests developed rituals where prisoners were sacrificed in increasingly elaborate ways. One involved slowly lowering victims into a furnace while priests chanted. Another required cutting out the heart while the victim was still alive. The tools were specialized. Archaeological digs have found bronze implements clearly designed for specific tortures. Curved blades perfect for flaying, pincers with grips for pulling tongues, hooks for eyes. These weren't improvised. They were manufactured. The smell must have been constant. Ancient Nineveh had open sewers and burning bodies. The palace courtyards were often used for mass executions. The king would hold banquets while prisoners were tortured in the same room. Reliefs show musicians playing while people are flayed in the background. The real nightmare wasn't even the dying, it was the living afterward. Because the Assyrians didn't just want you dead, they wanted you to carry their brand forever. They invented what historians now call the walking advertisements. After a city fell, they'd select hundreds, sometimes thousands, of survivors and mutilate them in signature ways, then release them. One campaign against Babylon describes 3,000 prisoners having their right hands cut off, then being sent home. Imagine limping back to your village, missing a hand, nose, or eyes, knowing every person who sees you will instantly know. They defied Assyria. This is what happens. One of the most sophisticated punishments was reserved for rebel kings and high nobles. It was called the dog treatment. The victim was stripped naked, fitted with an iron collar and chain, and forced to live in a kennel inside the royal palace. Sennacherib did this to the king of Sidon. The annals describe the former monarch eating from a bowl on the floor while Assyrian courtiers laughed. Some were kept like this for decades. One lived 27 years as the king's palace dog. They had a special category for priests who led resistance. These men were skinned alive, and their skins were used to cover sacred drums in Assyrian temples. The black obelisk shows this happening. The drum was then played during victory celebrations, so the priest's own skin literally announced his people's defeat. Women and girls faced horrors designed not just to destroy them but to erase future resistance. The annals are chillingly casual. I filled the streets with the bodies of their young men. Their young women I gave to my soldiers. That line appears over and over. Mass rape was official policy, carried out in public to maximize humiliation. Pregnant women were ripped open. Newborns were thrown from city walls while mothers were forced to watch. One inscription boasts, "I made their wives childless before their eyes." But the deepest cut was generational. They understood that killing adults wasn't enough. You had to break the children who would grow up wanting revenge. So they created the Assyrian education system. Young boys from conquered elites were taken to Nineveh, castrated and trained as eunuchs in the royal court. Girls were raised in palace harems. The message, your bloodline now serves the people who destroyed you. Archaeology confirms every word. In the ruins of Nineveh, excavators found mass graves with skeletons showing identical injuries, severed hands, crushed skulls, signs of live flaying. One pit held over 200 bodies, all decapitated, all with hands cut off first. In Ashurnasirpal's palace they found a room with thousands of human teeth trophies pulled from living victims. Even nature wasn't safe. Ashurnasirpal II describes cutting down entire orchards and salting the earth after conquest, so that no tree would ever grow again and no bird would sing there. He diverted rivers to flood cities, then dammed them to create permanent swamps of rotting corpses. The soldiers who carried this out paid a price most history books ignore. Clay tablets from military outposts are full of desperate letters. One captain writes to his wife, "The things I have seen cannot be washed from my eyes. I dream of the screaming." Another soldier requests leave because my hands shake too much to hold a spear. Desertion rates were so high that kings started executing entire regiments suspected of weakness of spirit. The kings themselves weren't immune to the rot. Ashurnapal, the last great Assyrian ruler, spent his final years in a darkened palace, terrified of the dark. He ordered prisoners flayed in his bedroom so their screams would drown out the ghosts. When he died, his own officials celebrated in secret. The system finally collapsed under its own weight. By 612 BC, every people they'd terrorized, Babylonians, Medes, Scythians, united in a coalition of pure hatred. When they sacked Nineveh, they didn't just destroy the city. They erased it so thoroughly that for 2,000 years no one could even find where it had been. The Greek historian Xenophon marched past the ruins a century later and wrote about massive abandoned walls covered in strange carvings, not realizing he was looking at the capital of the most terrifying empire in history. They found the palace of Sennacherib burned to the ground. The Babylonians had dragged his throne into the street, smashed it to pieces and pissed on the fragments. The great reliefs showing torture were deliberately defaced, every Assyrian face chiseled away, every victim left untouched. The message was clear. We remember who the real monsters were. Today, when you visit the British Museum or the Louvre, you'll see those same reliefs displayed as art. Clean, well lit, with little plaques talking about Assyrian craftsmanship. Tour guides mention the beautiful winged bulls and sophisticated administration. They rarely mention that those walls were designed as psychological weapons, that every scene of a lion hunt is actually a metaphor for what they did to human beings. The tools are still there. The bronze flaying knives, the pincers, The hooks, displayed in glass cases like curiosities. The annals are translated and available online. You can read Ashurnasirpal II bragging about building walls with living people bricked inside them, still breathing as the mortar set. The mass graves are still being excavated. In 2014, archaeologists in Iraq found another pit from Ashurnapal's reign. Dozens of skeletons, all teenage girls, all decapitated, all with their hands bound behind their backs. This wasn't a dark age. This was the height of their civilization. The same kings who built magnificent palaces and libraries also turned human suffering into a bureaucratic department with quotas and record-keeping. The Assyrian Empire lasted 300 years by making terror so absolute that resistance seemed insane. They were so successful at it that when they finally fell, the ancient world collectively decided to pretend they'd never existed. Greek and Roman writers barely mention them. The Bible calls Nineveh the bloody city and celebrates its destruction with glee. But the stones remember. Every carved relief showing a man being skinned alive. Every obelisk listing body counts like harvest yields. Every mass grave filled with identical mutilations. This was the original empire of calculated frightfulness. Rome learned from them. The Mongols studied their techniques. Every dictator who ever built a palace decorated with enemy skulls was walking in footsteps first carved by Assyrian kings. The tortures of ancient Assyria weren't a side effect of conquest. They were the point. The goal wasn't just to rule the world. It was to make sure no one who came after you would ever dare dream of freedom. And for 3 centuries, it worked. If this is the first time you've heard the unfiltered truth about what humans are capable of when cruelty becomes statecraft, drop never forget in the comments and share this with someone who still thinks ancient history is boring. Because the scariest part isn't that this happened, it's that they were proud of it, and the stones still carry their boast.